She had no name, no shoes, no memory of warmth, just a torn plastic tarp, a barn full of shadows, and eyes that had forgotten how to hope. But on that storm-split night, a single dad found her frozen, silent, and invisible to the world. What he whispered next would change both of their lives forever. If stories of quiet courage, unexpected love, and the healing power of kindness speak to your heart, take a moment to subscribe and join us on this emotional journey. Now, let's begin. With the night, the storm broke. The wind had teeth that night. It howled across the Colorado plains, gnawing at the wooden fences and clawing at the windows of the old Callahan farmhouse like it wanted in. Snow whipped sideways in sheets, transforming the landscape into a blinding swirl of white and shadow. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in protest against the cold, its orange glow dancing across aged wood beams and a pair of muddy boots left drying near the hearth. Ethan Callahan stood by the window, one hand braced on the frame, the other clutching a chipped ceramic mug filled with lukewarm coffee he'd forgotten to drink. Outside, visibility was down to nothing. He'd seen Colorado blizzards before, lived through dozens, but something about this one felt different. Wilder. Heavier. Like it wasn't just weather, it was warning. Behind him, Jacob, his 8-year-old son, snored softly from the couch under a wool blanket. The boy had fallen asleep halfway through a rereading of The Little Prince, one of the few books they both still reached for on hard nights. Ethan took another sip of his bitter brew, then turned when he heard it, a sound not belonging to storm or wind. A thud, distant, muffled. Again. He froze, narrowed his eyes, listened. Another thump, closer this time. From the barn. A curse slipped past his lips. He set the mug down gently so as not to wake. Jacob shrugged into his thick coat and grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door. It flickered to life reluctantly. Ethan stepped out into the storm and was immediately slapped in the face by the wind. He hunched forward and pushed toward the barn, each step a fight through thigh-high snow. The flashlight beam danced wildly, catching snowflakes and fence posts, the bare outline of the barn emerging in ghostly silhouette. He yanked the heavy door open. Inside, the air was musty and cold. The wind moaned through a broken upper slat. His boots crunched on hay. Then movement. He swung the light toward the far corner. There, curled in a tight ball in the straw, was a person. A girl. Young, barefoot, barely clothed. Her skin was pale blue tinged from the cold, and a torn plastic tarp was wrapped around her like a last defense. She didn't move, but her eyes were wide, glassy, and filled with something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time, raw, soul-deep terror. Jesus, he whispered, already moving. He dropped beside her, checked her pulse, shaky but there, and pulled off his coat. Hey, I got you, he said. Voice low and steady. You're okay now. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, just stared. He wrapped her in his coat and lifted her with care. She was lighter than she should have been, bones and frost. She smelled of dirt and fear, and something else beneath it, something that reminded him of gunpowder and burned wood. As he stepped outside, the wind roared again. The snow stung his face, but he shielded her body with his own as best he could, trudging back toward the flickering light of the house. Inside, he kicked the door shut and laid her gently on the rug near the fire. Jacob stirred, sat up groggily, and blinked. Dad Ethan put a finger to his lips. Stay there, bud. He retrieved the thick quilt from the couch and wrapped it around the girl's shivering form. Then he crossed to the armoire and opened the old cedar chest inside. His hands found what he was looking for, by touch a deep red scarf, soft with time. It had belonged to Ava, his late wife. He hesitated only a moment before bringing it over and draping it across the girl's shoulders. Her lips trembled, and she clutched it like a lifeline. Is she dead? Jacob asked, coming closer now. No, Ethan said. She's just frozen. We'll warm her up. The girl's eyes flickered toward the boy, then to Ethan. Her lips parted. A rasp of air escaped. Ethan leaned in. What is it? Her voice, if it could be called that, was little more than a breath. Run. It was all she said. Then her eyes rolled back and she slumped into the rug. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He stayed by her side, feeding the fire, draping her in blankets, spooning warm broth between her lips when she stirred. He called the sheriff's office, but the lines were down. Snow had taken out the towers again. Jacob stayed curled on the couch, eyes wide but quiet. He asked no more questions. He knew better than most children his age how fragile things could be, how quickly they disappeared. Morning came pale and silent. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world buried in stillness. The girl slept through the sunrise. Her breathing was steadier. Now, color slowly returning to her cheeks. Her clothes were too damaged to salvage, so Ethan left a stack of clean sweats and a flannel shirt beside her, along with a pair of wool socks. When she finally stirred again, it was Jacob who noticed first. He crawled closer, unafraid, and grinned. You fell from a star, he said simply. She blinked at him, confused. That's why Daddy says you don't have a name, Jacob continued. But you can borrow one. I think I'll call you Star. And for the first time since he'd found her, Ethan saw something shift in the girl's eyes, an almost imperceptible thaw, a flicker of something beyond the fear. Hope. The silence that followed her awakening was unlike any Ethan had ever known. It wasn't the hush of snowfall or the quiet between heartbeats. It was something deeper, like the sound a soul makes when it forgets how to speak. She sat at the kitchen table wrapped in Ava's scarf, her small hands curled around a steaming mug of broth she hadn't touched. Her clothes hung on her, like borrowed skin flannel shirt. Two big sleeves rolled up, collar pulled tight. The wool socks slouched around her ankles, damp from melted snow that lingered in her tangled hair. Jacob hovered nearby, coloring in a tattered sketchbook, with a box of crayons, occasionally glancing at her, with a mixture of fascination and concern, like a child watching a wild animal learning to trust. Ethan moved quietly around the room, boiling water for tea, slicing apples. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He knew better than to poke at something that hadn't mended. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Some wounds close from the outside in. But still, he watched. The girl Star, as Jacob had christened her, flinched whenever the wind rattled the window panes. Her eyes flicked toward the door, like she was calculating escape routes. She didn't ask where she was. She didn't ask for her name. Maybe she didn't have one anymore. Later that morning, while Jacob played outside in the fresh snow, Ethan brought her a towel and a hairbrush. I figured you might want this, he said gently, setting them on the armrest of the couch. Bathroom's just down the hall to the left. You'll find warm water. She nodded but didn't move. Ethan sat down across from her, elbows on his knees. You don't have to talk if you're not ready, but I need you to know something. She looked at him, not past him, at him for the first time. You're safe here, he said, voice low. Sure. I don't know where you came from or who you're running from, but no one's going to hurt you in this house. That's a promise. Her eyes brimmed with something fragile, like she might cry, but didn't remember how. Her lips parted, then closed again. He didn't press. He stood and left the room. 20 minutes later, he heard the bathroom door open. The water ran for a long time. When she emerged, her hair was clean and combed, the scarf still wrapped around her neck like armor. She walked past him back to the fire and sat down beside Jacob. He didn't look up from his crayons. Want to color with me? He asked. She hesitated, then reached for a crayon blue. That evening, Ethan set a bowl of stew in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. He met her gaze steadily. It's not poisoned. That earned him the smallest flicker of a smile. Barely there. But real. She took a spoonful. Ethan sat across from her again. "Can I ask you something?" She stiffened. "Not your name," he said quickly. "I figure if you wanted to tell me that you already would have." Her posture eased just a little. "What does the word run mean to you?" She froze. Her spoon paused midair. Ethan waited. Finally her voice came. Rough, broken. "It means don't look back." He nodded slowly. That's what it looked like. Like someone who didn't look back. She looked down into her bowl. "I didn't have time." Ethan leaned back, absorbing that. A moment passed. "Jacob thinks you fell from a star," he said, trying for a lighter note. That surprised her. She looked at him. Really looked. "Is that why you're calling me?" "Star?" He shrugged. He's 8. Everything magical still makes perfect sense to him. She blinked, as if unsure whether to accept that or resist it. "Would you like us to stop calling you that?" Her voice softened. "No, it's better than what I used to be." Ethan tilted his head. "What did you used to be?" She didn't answer, but her silence said enough. The snow kept falling for 3 more days. The phone lines remained dead. Roads unplowed. The world had shrunk to the size of the cabin, and its surrounding woods quiet, white, untouched. A sanctuary. During those days, Star began to exist in small ways. She folded Jacob's blankets, helped rinse dishes, brushed snow off the porch steps with the old broom. She still didn't say much, but her presence filled the cabin like a scent, warm, subtle, comforting. Ethan noticed how Jacob grew brighter, how he laughed more. He noticed how Star smiled at the boys' drawings, how she tilted her head when reading the faded children's books Ava had once read, aloud by this same fire. He noticed how at night, she sometimes sat awake long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring into the embers, with a look that broke something inside him, because he knew that look. He had worn it himself once not long ago. On the 4th morning the sky cleared. Sunlight poured in through frost-covered windows. Ethan found Star in the barn brushing down an old mule. She looked up, startled, but didn't flinch. "Didn't think you'd come back out here," he said. "I figured it owed me a second chance," she murmured. Ethan chuckled softly. "Fair enough." He leaned against a post. "You're good with animals." She nodded. "They don't ask questions." Ethan studied her for a moment. "You don't have to stay, you know. Once the road's clear, you can go wherever you want." She looked away. "I don't have anywhere to go." He hesitated, then said quietly, "You do now." She turned to him uncertain. "Jacob's taken to you," he added. "And I don't mind the company. Place gets too quiet sometimes." Something flickered in her expression, grateful but wary. "I don't know how to be." Anything, she admitted. "You don't have to," Ethan said. "You're here, that's enough." She nodded. Just once. That night by the fire, Jacob pointed to the sky through the frost-kissed window. "There," he whispered. "That's the one you came from." Star followed his gaze, saw the single bright dot hanging in the dark. She didn't correct him. Didn't need to. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't running. She was staying. And the silence inside her wasn't empty anymore. Snow softened everything. Sound, edges, memories. The world outside Ethan's cabin became a frozen hush of white, broken only by the whisper of wind in the trees and the slow creak of old wood settling under the weight of the season. Inside, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Star began to move through the house like someone relearning her place in the world, not as an intruder or a shadow, but as a presence. Quiet, careful, deliberate. She still didn't say much, but the silence around her no longer felt threatening. It felt chosen. Ethan had always believed there were different kinds of silence. There was the silence of grief, the kind that echoed long after words had been buried. Then there was the silence of survival, where noise became a threat. But the silence Star carried. It was the silence of someone waiting for permission to be human again. Each morning, Ethan made coffee in the old percolator and poured 2 mugs, one black for himself and one light, and sweetened with honey for her. She never asked for it that way. He just noticed. She always finished the one with honey. Jacob would wake late, dragging his feet into the kitchen, wrapped in his dinosaur blanket, and ask if the Star Lady was still here. "She's not a star, bud," Ethan would reply. But then he'd glance at her, sitting cross-legged near the hearth, with her hands wrapped around the warm mug face framed by a fall of damp hair, scarf still looped around her throat like a piece of sky. And maybe in some way she was. It wasn't a big thing that changed everything. It never is. It was just the wind. One afternoon, while Jacob was building a snow fort outside and Ethan was mending a drawer, the wind slammed a shutter loose. The bang echoed like gunfire. Star dropped the bowl she was drying. It shattered across the floor. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply collapsed. Her knees gave out. Her hands flew over her head. And she folded into herself on the linoleum, trembling so violently, Ethan thought she might seize. He was at her side in 2 seconds. Hey, it's okay." His voice was low but urgent. "It's just the shutter, just the wind." She didn't move, didn't speak. He didn't touch her, not yet. Instead, he crouched beside her and let his voice soften even more. "You're safe," he murmured. "You're in my kitchen, remember? The fire's going. Jacob's outside. It's just me and you and a broken shutter." She slowly uncurled her fingers. Her breathing came in ragged gasps. He saw then what fear did to a person. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet and buried, and came back like a ghost in the bones. Ethan eased himself to the floor beside her. "When my wife died," he said, more to the room than to her, "I stopped fixing things. The door squeaked for 2 years. The barn roof leaked. I let everything rot, piece by piece, because the silence was easier than remembering her laugh." She turned her face toward him, eyes still wet. "Then Jacob asked me one night if the house would fall apart like Mom did. So I got out the hammer the next day. A beat of quiet. 'I don't know what happened to you,' he said gently, 'but I know what it's like to live inside something broken. And I know it doesn't stay that way forever.'" She looked at him. Not through him. At him. Like a lifeline. Like a question. Then softly, so softly, he almost missed it. She said, "I used to be a person." Ethan didn't correct her. He just said, "You still are." That night, after Jacob went to bed, Star sat by the fire sketching something on a piece of scrap paper with a dull pencil. Ethan didn't interrupt. He let her be. She hadn't left the house in 2 days. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier. "Why did your wife keep that scarf?" He looked up from his chair, surprised. "She made it. When we were dating. It's beautiful. She wore it on our first date. And the last morning she was well enough to sit on the porch." He paused, then added, "I couldn't bring myself to throw it out." Star traced the edges of the paper with her thumb. "I don't have anything left like that." Ethan's eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time to start collecting new things." In the days that followed, Star began to come back to life in fragments. She started helping in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, folding towels, stirring stew. She laughed once at something Jacob said. A real laugh. Short, sharp, startled like it had escaped before she could stop it. And one evening as the snow fell heavy and slow, she asked if she could help chop firewood. Ethan handed her a smaller axe and watched as she tried, failed, then tried again. By the 5th log, she had the rhythm. By the 10th, she smiled. One morning while Ethan was out fixing the broken shutter, Jacob came up to her with his sketchbook. "This is you," he said, showing her the drawing. It was a stick figure with a big scarf standing under a sky full of stars. Star blinked, touched. "That's beautiful. I'm gonna hang it in my room." She leaned closer. "Why the stars?" he shrugged. "Because you were falling before you landed here. But now you're staying." She looked at the drawing again, then at the boy, and for the first time she didn't feel like something broken. She felt real. It was the night of the full moon when she finally spoke without fear. The cabin was dim, quiet, wrapped in the hush of snow and wood smoke. Outside, the world glittered under silver light, untouched and still. Inside, Jacob had already gone to bed, curled into his blanket with a flashlight under the covers and his sketchbook open to a half-finished drawing of their barn. Ethan sat in his chair by the fire, nursing a mug of tea, its steam curling into the room like a question waiting to be asked. Star stood at the window, arms crossed loosely over her chest, Ava's scarf draped across her shoulders like it had always belonged to her. She had grown more present in the past week, quieter, but not from fear. There was a calm to her now, a steadiness like she was beginning to inhabit her own skin again. But her past still hovered, like smoke, visible only when the wind shifted. "You always sit in that chair," she said, suddenly her voice so soft. Ethan thought he imagined it. He looked up. "Habit." She turned slightly, her profile lit by firelight and moon. "Did you sit there when she died?" There was no bitterness in her tone, just curiosity. Gentle. Human. Ethan nodded slowly. "I sat here the night we found out the cancer had spread, and the night Jacob asked if I thought she still watched us." Star took a step closer to the fire. "And do you? I think she watches Jacob," Ethan said, staring into the flames. "I think she'd like that he still sings in the shower." Star let out the faintest smile. "You didn't ask me about what happened. I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to." She hesitated. The room felt heavier, or maybe more honest. "I don't know how to explain it," she began, sitting slowly on the rug near the hearth. "Some of it's a blur. Some of it I remember too well." Ethan said nothing, only nodded for her to continue. "I was with someone," she said carefully. "At first he was charming, kind. He made me feel seen. But slowly, things changed." Her fingers tightened around her knees. "He controlled everything, what I wore, who I spoke to, when I could leave the house. When I tried to leave the first time, he locked me in the basement for 2 days. Said it was for my own good." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Quietly. I escaped in the middle of the night. I took nothing. No ID, no money. Just ran." She looked into the fire. "I didn't think I'd make it far. But the storm covered my tracks." Ethan exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. "You made it far enough." Her eyes met his. There was no pity in his gaze, just something stronger. Understanding. Respect. "He told me once," she continued, "that if I left, no one would want me. No one would even know I existed." "He was wrong," Ethan said. Star's voice faltered. "Part of me still believes it. Even now. Even here." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then let me be clear, Star. You are seen. You are real. And you matter here." Her lips parted slightly as if the words had struck something deep. "Why are you being so kind to me?" "Because someone was kind to me when I didn't think I deserved it," he said. "And because Jacob calls you Star, like it's the most natural thing in the world." She looked down, brushing at a tear she hadn't noticed had fallen. "I'm not used to kindness. You'll get there." Later that night, Ethan stood on the porch, letting the cold kiss his face, a ritual he kept to clear his thoughts. The sky above was endless, and full constellations stretching like stories across the dark. Star stepped out beside him wrapped in a quilt. "You don't sleep much," she said quietly. "Used to the quiet," he replied. They stood in silence for a while, side by side, watching the breath curl from their mouths. Finally, she asked, "Do you think a person can become someone else? Not pretend, not hide, but begin again?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at her, not at the scars she carried or the shadows in her eyes, but at the way she stood now, upright, steady. "I don't think people become someone else," he said. "I think they become who they were always meant to be once they stop believing the lies." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, "Then maybe I'll start here." He nodded once. "You already have." The next morning, she was the first one awake. Ethan came into the kitchen to find her already making pancakes badly. The batter was too thick, the skillet too hot. But she was laughing, when Jacob walked in and asked if she was trying to poison them both. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching. There was something about her. Then hair pulled back, messily apron crooked flower on her cheek that made his chest tighten in the best possible way. Not love. Not yet. But something that looked a lot like the start of it. That afternoon, Star found an old shoebox in a cabinet near the fireplace. Inside were Polaroids photos of Ava and Ethan when they were young. Her laugh, his beard before the gray. One photo was of the scarf, new bright red, wrapped around Ava's neck on a snowy morning just like this one. Star held it gently. Later, as they sat near the fire, she asked, "Why did she make it red?" Ethan smiled. She said it made her feel alive. Star pulled the scarf tighter. "Then maybe it'll do the same for me." The thaw came slowly, as it always did in Colorado, quiet and reluctant, like winter wasn't quite ready to let go. The snow began to recede from the porch steps, dripping in rhythm from the eaves, leaving behind soft earth and the promise of green beneath the white. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere changed with the weather. Star still. Star, though the name had become less a placeholder and more a quiet declaration, had become part of the rhythm of the household. She woke early now, not out of fear, but out of choice. She fed the chickens, swept the floors, helped Jacob with his reading, and started cooking simple meals, gradually replacing Ethan's predictable bachelor menu of eggs, toast, and coffee, with soups, biscuits, and a surprisingly good attempt at meatloaf. Ethan didn't say much about it, but he noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed the way she tied her hair up with one of Ava's old scrunchies, the way she hummed absent-mindedly when doing dishes, and how her hands no longer trembled when she reached for the door. He noticed how Jacob leaned against her when he was tired, or how she rubbed his back gently when he was nervous about his schoolwork. She was becoming a presence, not a visitor, a warmth, a thread in the fabric of their life. And yet there was always the question beneath it all. What happens when the road clears? It was a Wednesday morning when Ethan drove into town for supplies. The storm had finally let up enough to clear the road with the old snowplow, and the sun had turned the icy landscape into a sea of white diamonds. It was the first time he'd left the cabin in over 2 weeks. At the general store, folks greeted him with familiarity and concern, asking about Jacob, about the storm, about repairs. He answered politely, but briefly, always keeping one ear tuned to the police scanner behind the counter. Nothing unusual. He picked up coffee flour, fresh apples, and without thinking, added a bottle of lavender shampoo to the basket. The cashier raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask. Back at the cabin, Star and Jacob were in the yard building a small snowman. Well, Jacob was building. Star stood nearby, hands on hips, directing him like a foreman. She wore Ethan's old winter jacket, the sleeves still too long, and a wool beanie that made her look impossibly young. When she saw Ethan's truck, she waved. It was so normal, so ordinary, that it nearly knocked the breath out of him. That evening after Jacob had gone to bed, Star stood at the sink washing dishes while Ethan dried. "You were gone longer than I expected," she said, handing him a plate. "Picked up a few extra things," he replied. "Supplies?" "Road's clear, all the way into Pine Grove now." She nodded, eyes fixed on the soapy water. "So, the outside world is back." "Seems so." The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but uncertain. Star rinsed the last bowl and set it aside. "What happens now?" Ethan dried his hand slowly. "We keep living." "Same as yesterday." She turned to face him. "I mean with me." He looked at her carefully, searching her face. "You still feel like you need to run?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. But I also don't know what I'm allowed to want." Ethan exhaled, setting down the towel. "Well, I can't speak for the whole world, but in this house, you're allowed to want whatever makes you feel alive." She smiled, then small, soft, real. "And what if I just want more mornings like today? Then I'd say you're not alone." The next day, Ethan drove her into town. It was time, he said, for her to have a proper name, at least legally, and perhaps a library card. They stopped by the sheriff's station first, to follow up on the initial report. Star sat silently beside Ethan, her hands folded neatly head high. The deputy looked through the files. "We've had no reports matching her description. No missing persons from this region fitting the timeline." He gave Star a long look. "You sure you want to stay off-grid?" She glanced at Ethan, then back at the deputy. "I'm not trying to disappear. I'm just trying to begin again." That seemed to satisfy him. At the town clerk's office, she filled out the paperwork with Ethan standing nearby. When she got to the line marked "Name," she hesitated. Then slowly, carefully, she wrote, "Hope Leonard." Ethan caught the moment her pen paused the look in her eyes as she released that name into the world. She turned to him, almost bashful. "Hope," he said. "It suits you." They celebrated that night with apple pie and 2 melting scoops of vanilla ice cream. Jacob sang an improvised song about snowmen and waffles, and Ethan poured a small splash of whiskey into his tea for the first time in weeks. Hope, her name no longer needing quotation marks, stood at the window, with her mug looking out over the moonlit yard. "Do you think," she said quietly, "that it's possible to love a place, not because of what it is, but because of who you became?" There. Ethan stepped beside her. "Absolutely." She turned to him, eyes luminous. "I never knew what safe felt like until now." He didn't answer with words. He just reached over, took her hand, and gave it the smallest, surest squeeze. Outside, the snow continued to melt, revealing earth roots, and the first stubborn crocus peeking through the frozen soil. The sky had turned the color of pewter by late afternoon, hinting at another storm, though lighter this time. Ethan stood at the edge of the fence, mending a loose rail with a claw hammer and a mouthful of nails. Behind him, the soft murmur of Jacob's voice floated from the porch as he read aloud to Hope, who sat beside him with a blanket over her knees, listening as if each word stitched something back together in her chest. It was a quiet kind of day, one of those rare mid-March lulls, where spring knocked tentatively at the edges of winter, and no one quite knew what season to believe in. Until the truck rolled up the long drive. It was dark green, coated in road dust, with a grill that glinted like teeth. It didn't belong to anyone in town. Ethan would have recognized it immediately if it did. He straightened, hammer still in hand, as the engine cut. A tall man stepped out, lean, sharp-eyed, wearing a heavy black coat and a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon," the man said, voice casual. Ethan's instincts bristled. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone," the man replied, glancing toward the porch. "Heard there was a girl staying out here. Young, brown hair, Been missing a few weeks." Hope's voice went quiet. Jacob looked between her and the man, confused. Ethan stepped forward, subtly positioning himself between the stranger and the house. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, not moving. "Matt Leonard," the man said smoothly. "She's my wife." Ethan didn't blink. "That's so she left in a bit of a state." Matt continued, chuckling lightly. "Probably told you some wild stories. She's good at that." Behind Ethan, the screen door creaked. Hope stepped out slowly. Her face was pale, lips tight. She stood tall, but Ethan saw the tremor in her fingers as she clutched the edge of the doorframe. "Go back inside," Ethan said without looking at her. Matt tilted his head, eyes locking onto her like a predator who'd found his mark. "There you are, sweetheart." Hope didn't answer. She didn't move. Ethan turned back to Matt. "You're trespassing. You need to leave." "I'm her husband. I don't care if you're the Pope. Get in your truck and drive back the way you came." Matt's smile faded. "I'm not leaving without her." "That's not your call." Silence crackled between them, tense as wire. Matt took a step forward. Ethan didn't raise the hammer, but he didn't lower it either. In that moment, the distance between civility and violence felt paper thin. Then a sound broke through the tension sirens. Faint at first, then closer. 2 patrol cars kicking up dust on the road, lights flashing blue and red against the gray sky. Matt's eyes narrowed. "You called them?" "No," Ethan said calmly. "They've been looking for you." At the sheriff's office, Hope sat beside Ethan, fingers curled tight in her lap. Across the room, Matt was being booked, charged with domestic assault, unlawful imprisonment, and interstate threats. Apparently, after Ethan filed the missing persons report, a background check had been triggered. A warrant had already existed in another state. It had just taken time for the systems to connect. Deputy Harris came over, his tone unusually gentle. "She's safe now. You both are." Hope nodded slowly, though the words hadn't fully sunk in. She kept glancing at the holding cell window, half expecting Matt to burst through it, like a nightmare made flesh. Ethan reached over, covering her hand with his. "You don't have to run anymore." Her lip trembled. "I don't know how to stop." Back at the cabin that night, the quiet was different. Not peaceful, raw. Hope sat on the floor near the fire, knees drawn to her chest, staring into the flames like they were trying to tell her a secret she couldn't quite hear. Jacob was already in bed, sensing the shift in energy but too young to name it. Ethan brought her a cup of tea, crouched beside her. "I keep thinking it's not real," she whispered. "That he'll come back. That he'll find some way." "He won't," Ethan said. "You don't know that." "I know men like him," Ethan replied. "And I know people like you. People who survive." Hope looked at him, eyes red but fierce. "You didn't see what I was like before. I was nothing. I believed him when he said I didn't exist." Ethan's voice was soft but steady. "You believe different now." She didn't answer right away. "Then I want to." He reached into the pocket of his flannel and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this in the barn, in your coat. You dropped it." He handed it to her. The word "run," smeared and faint, still clung to the page like a final gasp. Hope looked at it, then into the fire. Then, without hesitation, she leaned forward and dropped the paper into the flames. It curled, blackened, and vanished in a breath of smoke. "I'm not that girl anymore," she said. Ethan nodded. "No, you're not." Later that night, she stood on the porch in her bare feet, letting the cool air bite at her skin, grounding herself in sensation. The stars overhead stretched across the sky like blessings. Ethan joined her, silent. They stood that way for a long time. Then she spoke. "I chose the name Hope because it sounded like something impossible. Something people say when they don't have anything else." He looked at her, the moonlight catching the soft rise of her cheekbone, the calm now beginning to settle into her bones. "It's not impossible," he said. "No," she whispered. "Now it's not." The next morning the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind that only appeared after something had been washed clean. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of coffee cinnamon and quiet healing. Ethan stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Jacob sat at the table scribbling in a composition notebook, his tongue sticking out in concentration. Hope leaned against the counter with a mug in hand, her gaze far off but softer than it had been in weeks. There was a silence between them, but this one wasn't laced with fear or memory. It was just peace. A fragile peace. The kind that made Ethan watch every expression on her face, the way a man watches a newborn foal take its first steps, hopeful, protective breath held just in case. That afternoon, while Ethan chopped wood out back, Hope sat on the porch steps reading to Jacob. Her voice still carried the rough edge of someone rediscovering speech, but it had grown stronger, firmer. Jacob leaned against her fingers, trailing absent-mindedly through the grass that had begun poking through patches of melting snow. Then Jacob coughed. Once. Then again, sharp and dry. "You okay?" Hope asked, touching his forehead. He nodded, but his face was flushed. When Ethan returned 20 minutes later, he found Jacob bundled in blankets with a glassy look in his eyes, and Hope crouched beside him, panic just barely held in check. "I think he has a fever," she said, standing quickly. He was fine, and then Ethan knelt beside Jacob, pressing the back of his hand to the boy's brow. "Yeah, he's burning up." They moved him to the couch and wrapped him tight. Ethan gave him water, a fever reducer, and murmured soft words, while Hope hovered unsure whether to stand back or step in. "He'll be okay," Ethan said, noticing her worry. "I know," she whispered, but her voice cracked. Because the truth was, she didn't know. Not for sure. That night was long. Jacob tossed and turned, sweat soaking through his shirt. His breathing became raspy, shallow. Hope never left his side. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside the couch, wiping his forehead every few minutes, with a cool cloth, whispering to him about things he loved. Snowmen, stars, the silly songs he made up on rainy days. She spoke like someone desperate to tether him to the world. Ethan watched from the kitchen, heart aching. He remembered nights like this with Ava, nights when Jacob had been a baby, burning with fever, and crying out for a mother already fading. But tonight there was no fear in the air, just fierce love. He stepped into the living room around midnight, handing Hope a fresh bowl of water. "You should sleep," he said quietly. "I can't." He sat beside her on the floor. "He's tough. He gets that from his mom." Hope looked at him, and in that look was something he hadn't seen before. Not sorrow, not gratitude, not guilt, but fierce protective purpose. "I never had anyone to sit beside me like this when I was sick," she said. "There was no one to whisper that I mattered. No one to say, 'You're gonna be okay.' I want him to have that. You're giving it to him." She blinked, her eyes wet. "I'm terrified I'll lose this," she admitted. Ethan's voice was steady. "You won't." She turned toward him. "How do you know?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Because this time, you're not alone." By morning, Jacob's fever broke. He woke with bleary eyes and a hoarse voice, but asked for pancakes, which Ethan took as the clearest sign of recovery. Hope laughed, relieved, exhausted, giddy, and hugged Jacob so tight he squealed. "You were worried," he mumbled sleepily. "Of course I was." He squinted up at her. "You're like a mom now." Hope froze, stunned, silent. Ethan looked over, expression unreadable. Jacob yawned, curled back into his blanket and drifted off again. Hope stood heart pounding. "I didn't mean." Ethan stepped closer. "He sees what's real." She stared at him, shaking her head. I'm not ready. I'm not whole. Ethan reached out and took her hands. You don't have to be perfect to love someone, he said. You just have to show up. Hope's breath caught in her chest. I never thought I'd have this, she whispered. Not a family. Not peace. Ethan's eyes searched hers. You think this is peace? She nodded. The kind I used to dream about right before waking up to something cold and dark. He stepped closer. This isn't a dream. This is real. And it's yours. Tears welled in her eyes, and she let them fall without shame. For the first time, they weren't tears of grief. They were of belonging. That evening after dinner, Ethan found Hope in the barn brushing down the mule with methodical care. The lantern glowed warm against the wooden beams. He leaned on the stall door, watching her in silence. I used to be afraid of this, she said. The stillness, the quiet. And now I want to protect it. Ethan stepped forward. Then protect it with us. She looked at him, heart in her eyes. You mean that I've never meant anything more? He reached out and she met him halfway. There in the scent of hay and old wood, they held each other not out of need, not out of fear, but as two people who had learned what it meant to be broken and still believe in something better. Something they were building. Together. Spring announced itself with the quiet insistence of life refusing to be buried. The snow retreated fully by mid-April, giving way to soft soil and patches of wild crocus blooming along the edge of the tree line. The barn smelled of thawed hay and the faint sweetness of damp earth. Songbirds returned, and Jacob named each one with the kind of confident inaccuracy only a child could possess. Hope had taken to mornings on the porch, barefoot with coffee in hand, watching the world stretch into green. Sometimes she wrote in a small leather-bound notebook she kept close, but rarely shared. Sometimes she just sat, eyes half-lidded, as if soaking in the miracle of simple stillness. Ethan watched her often from the kitchen window, never interrupting. He had learned by now Hope bloomed when no one was asking her to. One Saturday, Jacob insisted they go into town for Saturday donuts, a tradition Ethan had half forgotten since Ava's passing. Hope volunteered to stay behind, saying she had laundry to catch up on and a new row of carrots to plant. Her hands, once tense and unsure, now worked the garden like they'd always known soil. When Ethan and Jacob returned with 2 boxes of pastries and a new comic book, Hope was standing at the trellis near the garden, wearing jeans rolled at the ankles and a pale blue blouse Ethan had never seen before. She looked up and smiled. And just like that, something clicked into place. A vision Ethan hadn't dared entertain. A life, not borrowed, not temporary, but real. That night, they ate on the porch, fried chicken potato salad and slices of peach cobbler. Hope had somehow pulled together from canned fruit and imagination. The evening air was warm enough to leave the door open, and the scent of lilacs drifted in with the breeze. Jacob fell asleep on the porch swing with a comic book on his chest. Ethan and Hope sat on the steps, shoulders brushing now and then. She glanced sideways. I used to think normal was something other people got to have. He took a sip of tea. And now I'm starting to think normal is just a quiet evening with people who don't expect you to vanish. He smiled. We're not expecting you to vanish, Hope. She was quiet for a moment. I've been waiting to ask. Ask what she turned to face him fully. Eyes searching his. What happens now between us? He took a long breath. I think I've loved you for a while, quietly, without pushing. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. I'm not broken anymore, she said, but I'm still learning how to live. Ethan looked at her, heart full. Then stay. We'll learn together. She swallowed. What if I mess it up? He leaned in, touched his forehead to hers. Then we start again. Every day, if we have to. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Are you sure? He cupped her cheek, calloused thumb brushing her skin. Stay with me forever, he said. Her eyes shimmered. I was waiting for you to say that. The days that followed took on a new rhythm, not different, just deeper. They moved as a family now. Meals were shared with casual joy, laughter folded into routines, and the future no longer felt like a question mark. Hope filed her legal name change in town. The clerk who once looked at her with suspicion now greeted her with a nod and a warm smile. At the library, she applied to volunteer in the children's reading program. When asked about previous work experience, she simply wrote, "Caretaker resilient survivor." And at home, she replanted the flower bed Ava had once tended, kneeling in the dirt, with Jacob beside her, naming each bulb with new beginnings. One evening in early May, Ethan brought out an old photo album. The three of them sat on the living room floor as he flipped through pages of faded Polaroids, Ava's wind-blown hair, Jacob as a baby, camping trips, birthdays. Hope touched one photo gently. Ava wrapped in that red scarf, snowflakes clinging to her lashes. She looks like someone who laughed easily, Hope said. She did, Ethan replied, especially when things were going wrong. She would have liked this, she added softly. Us. I think she does, Ethan said, and for the first time, Hope didn't look away when he said it. They sat in that silence for a while, Jacob asleep beside them, the fire burning low. Then Hope whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Ethan smiled. You gave me a reason to begin again. It wasn't perfect. Hope still had nightmares sometimes, and Ethan still kept Ava's old coffee mug in the back of the cupboard, not quite ready to let it go. Jacob still asked difficult questions about heaven, about why some people leave, about whether stars remember where they came from. But it was real, and it was theirs. One morning, Hope stood in the doorway with dirt-stained hands and a smudge of flour on her cheek, and said, I think this is the first place I've ever felt like I belong. Ethan walked over, kissed her gently on the forehead, and said, Then let's keep building it. One morning at a time. The knock came on a Tuesday. It was the kind of day that held no hint of trouble. Sun warm on the porch rail, bees humming lazily among the lilac bushes, and Jacob sprawled in the shade of the barn with a box of sidewalk chalk, drawing an elaborate zoo of imaginary creatures. Inside, Hope was in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread, flour streaked across her cheek, her sleeves rolled up, and her hair braided loosely down her back. Ethan had just come in from chopping wood, sweat still cooling on his brow, when they both heard it 3 solid knocks at the front door. Hope froze, the rolling pin in her hand stilled. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, who held her gaze a moment too long. He stepped quietly to the front window and parted the curtain. A man stood on the porch, older, thick-set, dressed in a rumpled suit tie askew with the air of someone who hadn't slept in days. Not a threat, but not familiar either. Can I help you? Ethan called through the closed door. The man nodded. I hope so. My name's Raymond Leonard. I'm looking for my daughter. Ethan's stomach turned cold. He opened the door, slowly stepping out onto the porch. Your daughter? Yes, the man said, rubbing the back of his neck. Her name is Hope Leonard, or it used to be. She disappeared over a year ago. I've been looking ever since. Behind him, Hope appeared in the doorway, pale and wide-eyed. Dad. The man turned. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at her, like a man seeing a ghost. Hope, he breathed. You're alive. They sat in the living room, tea growing cold on the coffee table. Hope sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders tense, her hands knotted in her lap. Raymond sat across from her, slumped in the worn armchair like a balloon deflated, after a long, impossible journey. Ethan stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching carefully. "I thought you were dead," Raymond said. "The police gave up. Your friends gave up. Your mother stopped talking about you entirely. She said grieving was easier than not knowing." Hope swallowed hard. "You never came to look for me." "I did," he said quickly. "Everywhere. But your name was changed. There were no records, no trail. And God, Hope, when your husband told us you'd vanished, we thought he was the victim." Ethan's voice cut in low and calm. He lied to everyone, including her. Raymond looked between them. "I know that now. After the arrest, after the truth came out. But it doesn't make the year I lost easier to bear." Hope sat up straighter. "You don't get to say that." He blinked. "You didn't believe me when I said he was hurting me. You said I was dramatic, that he was stressed, that I should be more supportive." Raymond's face crumpled. "I was wrong. God, Hope, I was so wrong." Silence fell between them, heavy and old. Finally, she said, "I'm not who I was. I'm not asking for the past back. I need to know you're not here to take this away from me." Raymond's expression softened. "I wouldn't dare. You've clearly built something better than anything I ever gave you. I just wanted to see you again. To say I'm sorry." Hope nodded slowly. Then, after a long pause, "You just did." Later that night, Hope sat on the porch steps, staring at the stars. Ethan joined her, lowering himself beside her, with 2 mugs of cocoa. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, blowing gently on her drink. He was the last ghost. Ethan tilted his head. "The last one. The last piece of the old world. The version of me who apologized too much, who tried to make other people's guilt her own." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then gently, "You didn't owe him forgiveness." "I didn't give him forgiveness," she said. "I gave him closure." She glanced at him. "That's different." He smiled faintly. "It is." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars blink into view. "Do you ever wonder if we're being tested?" she asked suddenly. "All the time." She laughed softly. "I used to think tests were things you passed or failed. Now I think they're just doors. You walk through or you don't." "You walked through," he said. "So did you." The next day, Raymond came back not to visit, but to leave something behind. Hope met him at the edge of the driveway. He handed her a small box, old and weather-worn. "I kept this," he said, "even when I thought I'd never see you again." Inside were childhood drawings, a seashell she'd found at age 6, and a crumpled note she'd once left under his pillow. "I love you even when you yell?" Hope stared at it for a long time, then nodded. "Goodbye, Dad." Raymond didn't try to hug her. He only said, "I'm proud of you," and walked back to his car. When he was gone, Ethan appeared at her side. She held the box close, then handed it to him. "Let's bury it," she said. "I don't want to carry it anymore." They dug a small hole near the flower bed, laid the box inside, and covered it with soil. Hope patted the ground once, like tucking something in for a final sleep. That night they danced. There was no music, just the wind and the hush of the trees, and Jacob's giggles in the distance. Ethan took Hope's hand under the fading dusk and spun her gently, their laughter mingling with the scent of lilacs and earth and new beginnings. And in that moment she knew the past had been honored, but it would not be repeated. It began with a single white bloom. Hope found it one morning after the rain, quiet, unannounced, peeking through the soil near the back porch. A tiny crocus petal still trembling from the night chill, stretching toward the light with a stubborn kind of grace. She knelt beside it, touched the damp earth around its base, and whispered, "There you are." It hadn't been planted, at least not by her. Maybe Ava long ago, Or maybe a bird had carried it a gift, without meaning that bloomed into meaning all the same. Either way, Hope took it as a sign. Spring had come, and it had chosen to stay. By late April, the garden was fully hers. What had once been a half-wild patch of neglected earth behind the cabin now held rows of kale beans and early lettuce. Along the outer edge, she'd planted marigolds and lavender, believing without needing proof that beauty kept pests away better than chemicals ever could. Jacob helped after school, proudly labeling each row with hand-painted signs, carrots and beans and lettuce. Ethan installed a weathered bench beneath the oak tree, where he'd often sit in the evenings, watching her work, mug and hand sleeves rolled up heart as wide open as the soil beneath her feet. Hope no longer flinched at sudden sounds. She no longer kept a bag packed just in case. She wore her hair down more often now, no longer afraid to take up space in the wind. And at some point, though, no one could name exactly when she began to laugh without looking around first, as if waiting for permission. She didn't need it anymore. The garden grew, and so did everything else. Hope started volunteering twice a week at the Pine Grove Library, reading picture books to restless toddlers and quietly shelving novels in the adult fiction section. She took a course online in early childhood education, unsure of where it would lead, but finally curious again about later. One Saturday, Jacob ran into the kitchen holding a flyer. "You should open a booth at the spring fair," he said. "We could sell your flowers." Hope laughed. "It's a vegetable garden, Jacob. But you grow the pretty stuff too," he insisted. "And people would come just to see you smile." Ethan leaned on the counter watching her. "He's right, you know." She looked between the two of them, then folded the flyer and tucked it into her notebook. Maybe. But the word didn't mean no. That evening, they had dinner outside on the back porch, roasted chicken salad from the garden, cornbread still warm from the oven. Fireflies blinked lazily at the edges of dusk. Jacob told a long, meandering story about a pirate who turned into a gardener and fell in love with a mermaid who didn't like dirt. Hope and Ethan listened with solemn expressions, as if it were a sacred epic. Afterward, Hope cleared the dishes, while Ethan lit the small fire pit they'd set up earlier in the season. When she returned, he was sitting on the bench, poking at the coals with a stick. She joined him, the fire warming her shins, the sky above unfolding with stars. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "This kind of life. I used to dream about freedom, but freedom always meant leaving, running, starting over. Not roots." Ethan nodded. "That's because nobody told you freedom could feel like staying." She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "They ask at the library sometimes," she murmured. "What my full name is, for forms, records." He waited. "I always hesitate," she continued. "It's not that I don't know who I am now. It's just, I never had a name I chose for myself. Not really. I want one that means something." Ethan turned, slightly brushing her cheek with the back of his fingers. "Then choose it," he said. "Make it yours." She looked at the garden in the fading light, at the single white bloom still standing tall despite the wind. "I want to be called Hope Leonard Callahan," she said. Ethan didn't speak right away. Then he smiled, slow and sure. "We can make that official." She turned toward him. "Are you asking?" He set the stick aside, took both her hands in his. "I wasn't planning on it tonight," he said with a nervous chuckle. "But yes, I am now." Her breath caught. "I don't have a ring yet," he continued. "But I have this place, this garden, this home. I have Jacob, who already calls you his almost mom. And I have a promise I'll make to you every morning I wake up beside you." Hope didn't cry. She only smiled, bright, real, unafraid. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 100 times." They told Jacob the next morning. He whooped and asked if he could be the one to walk her down the aisle even though she's not going anywhere. Ethan ruffled his hair. That's exactly why. Hope beamed, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the past fade, not into erasure, but into perspective. It was behind her. Not denied, not erased, but no longer defining. She was no longer a woman with no home, no name, no voice. She was Hope Leonard Callahan by choice, by love, by miracle. And in the garden that bore her name, she found her future growing right alongside her. They were married on the last Sunday of May, beneath the tall cottonwoods behind the cabin. There were no pews, no long aisle, no string quartet, just mismatched chairs borrowed from neighbors, bouquets of wildflowers gathered from the edge of the meadow, and a sky so blue it looked freshly painted. Hope wore a pale linen dress that brushed her ankles when she walked simple and free, with her hair down and loose like a ribbon of light. The red scarf, now softened by time, was tied around her wrist. Ethan wore the same shirt he'd worn on their first date in town, the day they'd walked down Main Street with Jacob between them, swinging from hand to hand. Jacob stood proudly between them during the ceremony, holding the ring box and grinning like the keeper of a secret bigger than the sky. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," said the county clerk, who had happily agreed to perform the ceremony when Ethan asked. "And I believe someone would like to say something." Jacob stepped forward with the confidence of a boy who'd grown into a life that finally fit him. "I think," he said loudly, "that we're the best family on this whole mountain, and if anybody wants to challenge that, we'll throw a pie at them." Laughter rippled through the gathered friends. Hope crouched and pulled Jacob into her arms. "You're the best part of this family," he whispered in her ear. "You're my best mom. For real." Tears blurred her vision, but this time she didn't wipe them away. The reception was simple folding tables, set with potluck dishes, mason jars filled with daisies, lemonade, and peach cobbler. Hope danced with Ethan under the cottonwoods as twilight rolled in bare feet, pressed into grass, his hand steady at her waist, hers resting over his heart. There was no music at first, just the rustling of the trees, the occasional chirp of crickets. But then someone brought out a Bluetooth speaker and played an old folk song Ava used to hum in the kitchen. Ethan froze when it came on. Hope looked at him gently. "You okay?" He nodded, his voice rough. "Yeah, she'd like this. She always wanted to see the garden bloom again." Hope leaned in, her forehead pressed against his. "She sees it now." They danced until the stars came out. Later that night, long after the guests had gone, after Jacob had fallen asleep wrapped in a quilt on the porch swing, Ethan and Hope walked hand in hand into the garden. It was bathed in moonlight. The lavender had bloomed early, casting soft shadows across the soil. The crocus, the first one, still stood near the trellis, proud and small and stubborn. "I want to tell you something," Hope said, her voice low, steady. Ethan squeezed her hand. "You can tell me anything. I used to be afraid of growing roots. I thought it made me easy to trap, easier to burn down." He waited. "But now I understand that roots don't trap. They anchor, and they grow toward the light." Ethan turned her gently to face him, his eyes warm. "You've always been light." Hope smiled. "No, but you showed me how to find it again." They stood there for a long time, just breathing, as the wind moved gently through the tall grass, and the stars blinked quietly above them, like watchful old friends. In the weeks that followed, the cabin seemed to hum with a kind of new energy, not frantic or rushed, but full. There was always movement, Hope painting the pantry shelves, Ethan fixing the front steps, Jacob running between them with comic book stories and peanut butter on his face. The mailbox began to fill again, not with bills or legal notices, but with library confirmations. Seed catalogs, invitations from neighbors. People in town started calling Hope by her full name, not because it was on any official document, but because they could see she wore it proudly. Hope Leonard Callahan. Every time she signed it, a little part of her heart sighed in relief, like it had been waiting for this signature all along. One late afternoon, Jacob stood at the garden gate holding a weathered notebook. "Can I read you my poem?" he asked. Hope and Ethan were sitting on the porch, swing hands loosely clasped. "Of course," Hope said. Jacob cleared his throat and read aloud, voice earnest. "There once was a star that fell from the sky, and everyone thought it was gone. But it landed here in our backyard and grew into something strong. Now we have a garden and a mom who laughs and sings. And I know that sometimes stars come back as living things." Hope's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan blinked quickly and failed. Jacob closed the notebook. "It's for the school poetry contest. But I don't care if I win." "You already did," Ethan said, pulling him into his side. Hope kissed the top of Jacob's head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You saw me before I did," she whispered. Jacob shrugged. "I just knew you were mine." That night, Hope tucked Jacob in and kissed him goodnight, just like she did every evening now. Then she stepped outside to find Ethan waiting with 2 mugs of tea and a blanket. They sat on the porch, swing the sky wide and indigo above them. "Do you ever think about the first time you saw me?" she asked. "All the time," Ethan said. "What did you see?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I saw someone freezing, terrified, broken. But I also saw something else." "What?" He smiled. "I saw someone who hadn't given up yet, someone who still had fight in her even if she didn't know it." Hope looked at him, her eyes soft. "You whispered, 'Stay with me forever.'" "I meant it," he said. "I know," she replied, leaning into his shoulder. "That whisper saved me." They rocked, gently wrapped in warmth and memory and quiet joy. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the world held its breath in a kind of sacred stillness, Hope closed her eyes and exhaled, not fear, not sadness, but peace. She had fallen from the storm. She had landed in the light. And she was home. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and share your thoughts. Did this story speak to something in your heart? If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope, healing, and quiet miracles to life. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, take care of yourself and never stop believing in second chances.